This morning, our scripture passage comes from the Gospel of Mark, the 2nd chapter. We'll begin with verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, the temple where Abiathar was high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence of God, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Here ends the reading of God's holy word. May God bless it for our hearing and understanding. You can't get a Chick-fil-A sandwich today, right? They're closed on Sundays. Same for Stewart's Hot Dogs, Jim's Spaghetti, Cam's Ham, and a few other places. I've noticed, as I've been back to Huntington the past few months, that there are more places closed on Sundays here than in Charlotte. Because we're all about the money in Charlotte, let me tell you that. We're about the money in Charlotte. Closed on Sunday retail stores and restaurants used to be mandatory. Blue laws in the United States prohibited many things on Sundays, because until the late 20th century, Sunday in America was the Christian Sabbath, a day of worship and rest. Now, these laws were products of trying to observe the Bible's commands about the Sabbath. Now, last week I told you that there are over 30 commands in the Bible about how we're supposed to treat the immigrant fairly and justly. Well, there's over 40 commandments in the Bible about keeping the Sabbath, beginning with the 10 Commandments. By the way, the fourth of the 10 Commandments, the one about keeping the Sabbath, also has instructions to make sure that immigrants rest on the Sabbath as well. So if you own a farm and you have immigrants working for you, you can't make them work on the Sabbath while you're kicking back with a glass of iced tea. They get a Sabbath as well. If you want to look it up, it's in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5. You know, in our passage today, Jesus thought the religious leaders of his day had made honoring the Sabbath a burden. Notice that his critics were quick to criticize. That sentence, that was not in the manuscript. Critics and criticize, don't go together. Of course, go together. His critics mentioned that he and his disciples were plucking grain from a field they were walking through because they were hungry, I guess smashing it with their fingers and eating it, which technically was harvesting, which would be work and prohibited by the Sabbath. Jesus, in response, says the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. The Sabbath command is the most radical economic policy in the whole Bible. But often, we just think it's about making people come to worship. How do we honor the Sabbath without going back to laws which restricted what people could and couldn't do? How do we honor it without making it a burden? Among industrialized nations, workers in the United States take the least amount of vacation days. And it's not just because companies in the U.S. have an average less vacation time than European nations. A Pew Research study last year reported that 46% of workers do not take all their vacation days. It's nearly half of us. U.S. workers, on average, leave 6 days of vacation on the books. Their companies are offering vacation days that they never take. You know, in 1981, I was a freshman in college. The average U.S. worker took 4 more days of vacation than they do today. These are attitudes that we have as people about taking vacation, taking Sabbath. You know, one of the great things about remote work is that you don't have to commute to work, which in Charlotte is getting longer and longer. Working at home means you also get to sit around in comfortable clothes, right? You can work in your sweats, your pajamas if you want to. Maybe put on a shirt if you have to go on a Zoom camera conversation. Even though we have work that's more casual clothing today, nobody goes into the office wearing tennis shoes, sweatpants, and a hoodie, right? But you can do that at home. That's one of the great things. One of the terrible things is that when you do remote work at home, sometimes it's hard to make a boundary between work and home. Our phones have nearly the capacities, just in an inconvenient size, as our laptop computers. So many of us, because we have our phones with us at all times, are doing work when we're out and about. We could be in the backyard gardening and we get a text or an email and we feel like we have to answer it right then. It means that many of us never get away from work. I'll bet a lot of you in here, and you don't have to raise your hand, a lot of you in here have sent a work email at 11 o'clock at night. I gotta confess, I've done it too. We have blended the boundaries between work and home. We're always on call. We're hopping on the phone to answer a work email or text, and we take nearly a week less on vacation than 2 generations ago. So how in the world do we let God's command about Sabbath sink into our souls and rest according to God's commands for us? One of the problems about trying to honor the Sabbath, is that our world is very different from the biblical world, which was agricultural. Almost everybody in Jesus' day was a small farming peasant. Life was hard. It was physically hard. The human need for rest was vital on a regular basis. The economic forces of the time would have driven people to work 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, had it not been for the Sabbath law. The Sabbath command to rest 1 day a week was radical. No other community around Israel had such a command. Without it, royal and wealthy landowners would have forced the poor to work every day with no break. See, we think the Sabbath command is a worship command, and it is. But it's also a justice command, seeking justice for the working poor. In Deuteronomy's version of the 10 Commandments, it says so specifically. Here's what it says. You shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your slave or your donkey or any of your livestock or the immigrant in your towns, so that they may rest as well. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand. Therefore the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. You were not to do what the Egyptians did to you. This is where this week's sermon and last week's sermon interact, when God's command to Moses specifically included immigrants. All were to take a rest. The blue laws that protected the Sabbath in the United States during the 19th and 20th centuries did essentially the same thing. It was an agricultural economy in the 19th century, became the industrial economy of the late 19th century, early 20th century, which for workers often meant harsher and longer hours and a disconnection between family and community. Today, however, our economy is driven by the financial sector, with the service industry right behind. Manufacturing and agricultural, the most physically demanding economic sectors, now employ a minority of workers in our country. And because of the 20th century labor movement, have more laws protecting them than those in the financial or service sectors. Some of these laws, like the 40-hour work week, protect workers better than what the blue laws ever could. For white-collar workers, physically resting may actually be the worst thing they could do to honor the Sabbath. Think about this for a moment. If you're sitting at a computer all day, the last thing you need to do is just rest, right? For those of you who have those white-collar jobs where you're at desks all the time, and maybe you're at conferences and you're having networking meetings, the most important thing you can do to rest is to rest your mind and probably physically do something. If you're in that kind of industry, maybe the best thing you can do on a Sunday afternoon after worship is mow the lawn, or go work in the garden, or take a straight hike somewhere, or some other physically demanding thing where you can just do and not think. Jesus' day, where almost all work was physical labor, is different for many of us in our day. Rest will look different depending on what kind of work you do. So if we're going to try to honor the Sabbath, we've got to think about, what does rest mean to me? How can I rest, give space in my life, and honor God and worship? That may look differently to us depending on what we do during the week. A second issue that comes up when we're trying to honor the Sabbath in the 21st century is when to do it. Biblically speaking, the Sabbath is on a Saturday, the seventh day. Christians, except for Seventh-day Adventists and Seventh-day Baptists, yes, there is a group of Baptists called Seventh-day Baptists. I mean, let's face it, folks, there's just about some kind of Baptist group for about anything you can think of. That's just the way we are. Christians, except those two groups, have literally been breaking the Sabbath for 2,000 years. Christianity, within a few decades of Jesus' death, began worshiping on Sunday to acknowledge and to celebrate Jesus' resurrection on Easter Sunday, and to also distinguish themselves within the Jewish community, because the first Christians were Jewish. So Jewish Christians began worshiping on Sunday to distinguish themselves from Jewish communities that did not follow Jesus. In doing so, we set a precedent that the day you celebrate the Sabbath is secondary. And for 2,000 years, we've just said, okay, everybody, let's just make the Sabbath not Saturday, but Sunday. In our 24/7 world, I think we've got to think about that. God automatically gave us rest in creation in two ways. First, God put the Sabbath on the seventh day, which completed the creation process, as if God knew that humankind and in fact all of the natural world needs rest, needs a time to refill and refuel. And God put that into the ordered part of creation, right? By spinning the earth around. Half of the day we get light. Half the day we get night. And then we invented electricity. Now you can work 24 hours a day. Maybe not you as an individual, but your company, your hospital, your university. Somebody can be working for your company 24 hours a day. And some of us do that to ourselves with our 11 p.m. emails. If you have a job that requires you to work on Sunday, and you may have noticed I'm one of those people, you just take your Sabbath another day. It's what I've been doing for several decades now. If you find out that another day of the week works better for you, that's fine. It doesn't have to be Sunday. Find your place to have rest, refueling, and a way for you to honor and worship God. Maybe, in fact, because of your crazy schedule, you just need to use parts of a few days a week to be your Sabbath rest. When trying to honor the Sabbath, we have to get away from it's only this day. In a 24/7 world, this is how we have to work to figure out how to honor the Sabbath. Finally, honoring the Sabbath is also focusing on what's fair and just for workers and not just focusing on worship. Surprisingly, full-time blue-collar workers are actually somewhat protected by today's labor laws. It's actually white-collar workers in management and part-time workers that oftentimes have to cobble together 2 or more jobs to pay all the bills, who are most vulnerable in our economic system to keep you working and working and working. A living wage is a Sabbath issue because if wages are so low that people have to work 60 hours a week just to pay their bills, that becomes a Sabbath issue. When was the last time a politician talked about labor laws as part of God's command about the Sabbath? Have we ever heard that? Maybe it's time we as Christians begin talking about that, to enable people to honor the Sabbath by making enough money that they can have a day off. Regrettably, sometimes the church itself doesn't honor the Sabbath. I was doing some consulting work for a church some time ago, coaching them on updating their personnel policies. And one of the things I was doing, I was reading through all their documents, and their pastor's job description stood out to me. One of the first lines said, the pastor of XYZ church is a full-time position working 50 to 60 hours a week. I did some rudimentary math. 7 times 8 hours a day equals 56 hours. 50 to 60 hours. One of the first things I said to them as we began talking about their policies and so forth, I said, it'd probably be a good thing is if we as a church did not make our pastor break the Sabbath command every week, right? It'd be good if we expected the pastor to work a reasonable amount of hours a week so that he or she can truly take time for Sabbath. If the church hopes to show the world how to honor the Sabbath, Its congregations should start by the way they treat their employees. Having boundaries, protecting their space when they're not working, and what our expectations for the total amount of time we expect them to work would be helpful. Jesus told his critics, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. In order for us to realize the Sabbath is God's gift to us. God's been trying to give us time in our lives to rest, to ponder, to think, to pray, to honor God. And in this 24/7 world, I don't think this command is more needed than it has ever been. How can we as a congregation honor the Sabbath so, yes, we can worship, but also so we can justly deal with workers in our community and society? Let us be a church and a society that encourages rest from work and worship led by God. Amen.